regard to the vest itself and the work that Jan Jones was doing, would she be a better source of information in terms of the readiness, if you will, of that vest than you?
She would, as far as the readiness of the vest.
So if she said that the vest and the results that were being generated in terms of the small smoking trial that was done were generating inconsistent, uninterpretable results, would you have any reason to disagree with that?
If she said that, I wouldn't. No.
Okay. Now let's go back and make sure I understand what the end point of this experiment, the smoking vest experiment, would have been. It would have been, if I understand correctly, nicotine retention based upon varying levels or depths of inhalation, correct?
My portion of it.
Okay. And when you testified earlier, that's what you're talking about in terms of the end point, the depth of inhalation and its effect on nicotine retention, correct?
Right. So she would have measured if the changes in a smoker's pattern of smoking. Then we would have gone into the lab and had a number of different subjects reproduce those patterns of smoking and measure their retention of nicotine as a result of that, such that we could correlate it back with what she had observed.
Okay. Now, in the nicotine titration literature that you read, did you read that that was a short-lived phenomenon when one changes from a high delivery to a lower delivery cigarette?
Did I read that?
Yeah.
I don't recall having read that.
You don't recall reading it?
No.
Do you have a distinct recollection of the literature you read so long ago?
It was a long time ago, but what I recall was that a large number of people, they would switch to a low delivery cigarette. They would increase the number of cigarettes they smoked and the way they smoked, but eventually a large number of them would switch back to a high delivery cigarette.
Are you aware?
That's what I recall.
Okay. But you're not claiming to recall it all or claiming to have read all the literature, are you?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Did you read any of the literature that suggested that phenomenon was actually a titration for tar rather than nicotine?
It's very possible.
It's very possible, isn't it? Did you read that literature?
Well, nicotine in mainstream smoke is delivered in the tar and not in the gas bag.
Correct.
So if you were correlated with tar, it would probably correlate with nicotine too.
Right. And you're aware of the research, or are you aware of the research that suggests that when people smoke in a different pattern when they change from high delivery to low delivery cigarettes, that's a tar titration for taste rather than a nicotine titration?
That's possible.
Mm-hmm. But are you aware of that literature?
Part of the study would have been to see if they change their pattern of smoking with time of day, with whether they were in a stressful meeting, or whether they were having a casual cigarette after lunch. The environmental surroundings that they were in at the time was as much a part of the study as anything else.
Now, let's go back to the point of depth of inhalation and nicotine retention. Did you read the studies that examined that phenomenon?
To read studies that did it?
Yeah.
I don't recall any offhand.
Do you recall? So you don't recall reading studies that began back in the 1920s that examined nicotine retention as a function of depth of inhalation?
I don't recall them.
If there was literature that thoroughly investigated that phenomenon beginning in the 1920s, could that be one reason Philip Morris chose not to pursue this smoking vest study?
That could be a reason, yes.
And you're not aware of whether that literature exists, are you?
No, I'm not.
And you earlier testified that it was your opinion that Philip Morris didn't want to know the answer with regard to this research, correct?
That was my opinion at the time, yeah.
And you don't know what Philip Morris knew about the external literature that focused on this very concept that you wanted to test, correct?
That's correct.
And so if they knew of all this literature that was out there that had already thoroughly examined what you were proposing to test, that would be a very good reason not to do your experimentation, wouldn't it?
It would have been, but I would have thought that when the proposal was first put to them to develop the technique to measure, that they would have said no at that point, rather than let's spend the time to develop the technique and then say no.
But it would be a very good reason if that literature was out there not to approve your project, correct?
That's correct.
And when you say that Philip Morris didn't want to know the answer, you'll agree with me that that's just speculation on your part, correct?
That's correct.
Would you read back the question and answer on that one for me?
And when you say that Philip Morris didn't want to know the answer, you will agree with me that's just speculation on your part, correct? The answer, that's correct.
And when I talk about they didn't want to know the answer, they didn't know when you offered the opinion that Philip Morris didn't want to know the answer with regard to your end of the experimentation, inhalation and retention, that was just speculation on your part, correct?
Yes.
Now, on the nitrosamine research that you did between 1984 and 1992, I believe you stated that was in response, in part, to the literature out there generally on nitrosamines, correct?
And the work that was done between 84 and 92?
Correct.
Some of the work we did was in response to what was in the literature, yeah.
In other words, you saw something in the literature and you tried to replicate it in order to assess its validity, correct?
I would say that's how the project initially started. That there were reports in the literature, and they wanted, I think Philip Morris wanted to verify them. That was before I joined the project. I think that about the time I was joining the project is when they were beginning to expand into a more aggressive study of nitrosamines, and not just verifying somebody else's work, but also looking at how nitrosamines are formed, how they're delivered in the smoke, and how they can be reduced.
And that's very worthwhile research, isn't it?
Yes, I think so.
And it's also worthwhile research to attempt to replicate results that were reported in the external literature to see whether they're valid, correct?
That's correct.
And the subsequent work that you did at Philip Morris attempting to determine ways to reduce tobacco-specific nitrosamines in side stream smoke and mainstream smoke, that's very valid work as well, isn't it? It's important work is what I'm trying to say.
We actually only looked at the reduction in mainstream smoke. We did not really do any studies for reduction in side stream.
So the work in terms of reduction of tobacco-specific nitrosamines in mainstream smoke, that's important and worthwhile work, isn't it?
Yes. Now, let me qualify the answer that I made a while ago. As far as additives that were put on tobacco to reduce nitrosamines, now, actually removing nitrosamines from the tobacco itself through an extraction process such as ARC, it just followed that it would reduce side stream because it wasn't there to be transferred. And the precursors, such as the alkaloids, which were extracted out, weren't there, such that you wouldn't have the formation during smoking, so that those should be reduced.
I believe I asked you this, I apologize if I did. You're not an expert in whether or not tobacco-specific nitrosamines or nitrosamines generally are carcinogenic, are you?
An expert? No.
And one's training as a chemist, an analytical chemist, wouldn't qualify one to be an expert on that subject. Is that correct?
It wouldn't qualify them to become an expert. They could become an expert if they chose to do the studies. And
are you familiar with a researcher named Arthur Penn?
a researcher,
Correct.
Arthur Penn,
Penn.
I don't recall the name.
Okay. You wouldn't recall him from his research in nitrosamines?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. You're familiar with the journal Toxicology?
Yes, I am.
Respected peer-reviewed journal, isn't it?
I would say so.
Yeah.
Not being a toxicologist, I don't know how it ranks in the hierarchy of toxicology literature, but
Now, if there was an article published in Toxicology in 1996 by Arthur Penn that stated there is no evidence that NMK is a human carcinogen. Would you have any basis to disagree with that statement?
in 1996?
In 1996. Let me read the statement again. Would you disagree with the statement or have any basis to disagree with the statement that there is no evidence that NMK is a human carcinogen?
I wouldn't have any reason to disagree with him.
So you're not aware of any...
I would like to read the article, huh?
Okay. You're aware of no evidence to the contrary as you sit here today, are you?
No.
Now, age to side stream smoke from the Richmond smoke chamber is not the same thing as environmental tobacco smoke, is it?
I would probably put it in the same, I would just say yes, because it's an aged smoke, and that's what environmental tobacco smoke is. It's an aged side stream smoke. The particular smoking conditions in the room, in the chamber, produced very large amounts of smoke compared to maybe what you might find in a normal room. Because it was like an 18 cubic meter room, and you would smoke 30 cigarettes, so it'd be like having a room almost half this size with 30 people standing there smoking at one time. So I don't think you would call that a normal room.
Right. That'd be a phenomenally high level of smoke in the room, higher than you'd ever have in a conference room or a living room or an airline or anything like that, isn't it?
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially or almost definitely.
But depending on what kind of room you're in behind.
Okay.
If you got a bunch of guys sitting around a table playing cards, it might not be.
Well, let's go through that for a second then. The dimensions of the smoke chamber in Richmond are what?
It was, the volume of the room was about 18 cubic meters. That is approximately 9 feet by 10 feet by 7 feet high.
So smaller than a normal bedroom in somebody's house, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's more like a large walk-in closet.
Mm-hmm. And so you'd have how many cigarettes burning at a time there?
30. Could be 60.
Okay. So 30 or 60 cigarettes burning in a room about the size of a walk-in closet. Now, is there any furniture or anything like that in that room?
No, there's not.
Okay. Is there, what are the walls made out of?
Stainless steel.
Why are they made out of stainless steel?
So they can be washed down between experiments. The floor and the ceiling was stainless steel also.
So, was the room ventilated?
The mainstream smoke from the smoking machine was ventilated to the outside. The room itself had its own air conditioning and humidification system to keep it at a constant temperature and humidity.
So it's not ventilated outside, so the room is designed to hold in all the environmental all the side stream smoke that is created, correct?
Until the experiment's done, and then it's ventilated to the outside again.
That doesn't sound like anybody's office or living room or kitchen or airline or anything like that I've ever heard. It's really not, is it?
No.
It's a highly artificial experimental condition that's created for the purposes of your experiments, correct?
Put it in that class.
With extremely high smoke concentrations, correct?
Yes.
Now, an increase in N and K in aged side stream smoke over time in a laboratory setting in the smoke chamber doesn't occur in the real world, does it? In a office it's ventilated, or somebody's living room, or in an airline or anything like that.
I don't know.
You've never tested it, have you?
No.
Have you seen any research that's reported that N and K in environmental tobacco smoke in real-world situations increases over time?
Not seen any studies on that.
Have you seen any studies that demonstrate that it doesn't increase over time in real-world conditions?
You say it does or doesn't?
Doesn't.
No.
And what I'm trying to say, I'm sorry, I wasn't very clear. What I'm trying to say is you can't take the N and K level after an hour and 15 minutes in your smoke chamber in Richmond and say that's what would happen in Greg Fowler's living room, correct?
That's correct.
You couldn't say that would be the same level of N and K that would be in the airliner that I took to Australia last year, right?
That's correct.
Because they're totally different situations, correct?
And as far as the concentration of smoke in the room, yes,
Fresh side stream smoke's not the same thing as environmental tobacco smoke, is it?
no, it's not.
And aged side stream smoke's not the same thing as environmental tobacco smoke, is it?
I would think aged side stream smoke would come closer to being equivalent,
But they're still not the same thing, are they?
but not exactly. But
Now, you had mentioned follow her up and see where she went, did you?
that's correct.
Did you ever talk to Cathy Ellis directly about this situation?
No, I didn't.
You never said, Cathy, what's the deal? Why did you say I should get rid of this data?
I don't recall.
Why didn't you?
I spoke to Robin about it.
And what'd you say to Robin about it?
I told her that I thought that was important information. That if the levels that we measured at that concentration indicated that we could probably gain some very important information in regards to the formation of nitrosamines, that we could continue to investigate the reason. And she said we couldn't because we'd have to use production cigarettes.
Now, what I need to know is whether you had any direct contact with Cathy Ellis on this alleged destruction of data before, during, or after the alleged destruction.
I don't recall any.
You never talked to her about it. Who besides Robert Kinser did you ever mention this incident to? Well, let's break that down, because that's a little too broad. What I'd like to do is find out whether you talked to anybody, any of your co-workers at Philip Morris about the alleged destruction of this data, say within a month of when you say it occurred.
I think I probably talked to several people within a day of when it occurred.
Okay, now who would those people have been? And let me just ask, do you have a distinct recollection of talking to people, or are you just thinking that you may have? I really need to know that.
To the best of my recollection, when the samples were being analyzed, and I saw the increased peak, N and K peak coming out on the chromatogram, that I pointed it out to a Dr. Steve Hout, who was worked in the same lab that I did, and said, with just a general comment, look at how the N and K level is. Then after the...
What did he say in response to that comment?
Probably that, yeah, it is pretty high.
Yeah, not probably. Do you recall what he said?
Not specifically, but that's...
Okay, so you talked to Steve Hout, and that's H-A-U-T,
H-A-U-T.
about it as it was basically happening.
Right.
Who else did you talk to about it?
After I verified what the cigarette was and the data was destroyed, I don't remember specifically, but I probably may have said something to Steve of what had happened, and also to my two technicians who had worked up the data.
Okay, now let me stop you there if I can. Are you talking about a specific recollection of telling them, or are you saying that I probably would have told them?
As far as the technicians go, with Steve, I probably could have told them. As far as the technicians, I probably went back to them and conveyed to them and reinforced the fact that we were not supposed to run nitrosamines on production cigarettes, and because normally they were the ones that would interact with the technicians that worked for Roger Combs, and that if they became aware of the fact that production cigarettes were being run, then to not provide him with the collection traps to collect for him. And so in that type of conversation, I probably would have said that I destroyed the data.
Okay. Now, who are those technicians?
That would have been Patty Kurth,
How do you spell her last name?
K-U-R-T-H,
Who else?
and Ralph Kaiser,
K-I-S-E-R?
K-A-I-S-E-R.
Oh, K-A-I. Okay. Who else would you have told, or who else do you recall having told about the alleged destruction of documents?
At that time,
Yes.
no one that I can recall.
So you would have talked directly with Robin Kinser. Let me say it differently. The universe of people that you may have talked to about this would be Robin Kinser, Steve Hout, Patty Kurth, and Ralph Kaiser, correct?
Possibly Roger Combs, yeah. I mentioned him earlier.
Anybody else at the company?
Roger had two people that worked for him in the chamber, Cathy Tatum and Leonard Brown. They handled most of the runs, and potentially something may have been said to them. I was in and out of there all the time.
When you're told, well, let me say it this way. When you said that you were told to destroy the data, what was your reaction?
I just followed what I was told to do. I didn't particularly want to destroy it, but I followed what I was told to do.
Were you angry?
I wasn't angry. I was more interested in it from a science standpoint. That I thought that was one particular observation that we had made that could have a significant scientific impact on how nitrosamines might be formed during smoking, because we were very interested in the pyrosynthetic formation. And this obviously wasn't a transfer, so it had something to do with the pyrosynthetic formation. And to follow that up scientifically could give us some very important information as to how we may be able to prevent that formation. So I would very much like to have done additional research to investigate that.
We'll get back to that in just a second. Now, besides the chromatogram that was printed off the chromatograph, any other written record of that experiment?
Yes, there was one sheet of paper. I think there were 2 runs made in the chamber, and when we inject into the gas chromatograph, and we usually make like 3 injections of each sample. So I would have had a piece of paper that would have summarized that, would have averaged the results from all 6 injections.
Where's that piece of paper now?
It was shredded.
You shredded it yourself?
Yes.
Now, did you make any, well, let me back up and say, was there an entry made of that experiment in the log book for that particular smoke chamber?
There should have been.
And that log entry should have been sometime in the fall of 1989.
I would say yes, there was an entry made, because when I was given the sample, that's the way we numbered it. We had the log number entry, which was the day and the date. It was the date and the run number for that day.
Do you remember what the run number was?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
So like today's run number would have been like 04-24-96-123 or 4 to indicate which run number it was. And it had a run number like that on it, so I would assume it would have been in the log book.
So if this actually happened, there should be an entry in the log book reflecting that this experiment was run.
Could be.
Okay, now, we looked for it, and it's not there. Can you give me any idea of anything that would allow me to look at that lab book or that log book and identify this entry or an entry reflecting some experiment?
If you had the log book, it should be listed in there.
But what would it look like? What would it say?
What would it say?
Correct.
Log book would have had the run number, would have had the cigarette that was run. It would have had what analyses were collected for.
And so it would say TSNAs on it?
It would have had some indication of what collection tube was hooked up to which sampling port.
Do you know those details?
If it was, say, a TSNA, it may have said TSNA and again given sample ports like 10 through 14 or something like that.
But you don't recall what those would have been for this particular experiment?
No. Or it may, we went over to a solid phase collection method, which was an extra loop tube, which was a diatomaceous earth coated with a buffer, or saturated or wetted with a buffer. So it may have just said extra loop, which we used. It would have had numbers for other things like carbon dioxide levels, various gas-based things, and it would have had an entry of any abnormalities that occurred during the run, such if they were going to run 30 cigarettes and maybe only 29 lit, that only 29 were smoked.
What I'm trying to ask you is, are there any details of that variety that you can share with me that would lead me to that entry in the logbook?
All I can say is you'd have to have the logbook and go back to that time frame and look through it and see if there's an entry for Virginia Slam.
The cigarette would be actually listed in the logbook, the type of cigarette that was being tested, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and there were a lot of production cigarettes that were tested in the smoke chamber, isn't that correct?
I'm not aware of how many production cigarettes were tested.
But production cigarettes were routinely tested in the smoke chamber, correct?
I can't say that they were routinely tested, no.
Well, are you telling me that they were never tested?
No, I'm not telling you they're never tested, but I don't think you would. I classify routine as something you would do almost on a day-to-day or at least a week-to-week basis. I think the majority of the cigarettes that were tested in the room probably were an experimental cigarette or a development cigarette, but maybe were not a production cigarette. And they would have probably been identified by a code number.
Right, but you are saying that production cigarettes were occasionally tested in the smoke chamber, correct?
I think they were, yes.
And if they were, they would be listed by name, correct?
They should have been, yes.
So if you're testing a Marlboro in the smoke chamber, it would say Marlboro, right?
Yes.
But you're saying that when this Virginia Slims was being tested, that it had a number rather than the name?
No. Whenever we got a run back from the chamber, we got the chamber run number, not the cigarette code number. That's the way we kept up with it.
Well, you're talking about a run number.
For the run number for the chamber. Now, if we wanted to know what cigarette it was, if it was, of course, obviously, if it was a cigarette, a run that I had requested, I would know what cigarette it was. If it was a cigarette that somebody else had done, it would be listed in the logbook. But when my technicians got the run back, it would only have the run number. And for me to find out what cigarette it was, I would have to go ask or call or have one of them go find out.
And when you ask or call, they either come back with experimental cigarette code number, or if it was a production cigarette, the name of that cigarette. Is that right? Okay. Did you record this experiment in your own lab notebook?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
Because I showed the data to Robin before I got to that point. Because as soon as I had it tabulated and saw the numbers, I showed it to her. And when I was told to destroy it, I was told not to put it in my notebook.
She told you not to put it in your notebook?
Obviously, yeah.
Tell me. Well, tell me everything that she said to you from the point in time that she got back after leaving the office to coming back and telling you to destroy the data. What exactly did she say?
I had gone back to my desk. I knew she had gone up because she had told me she was going up to see Cathy. And so I went back to my desk and was working on some other things. She came back and she said that she had talked to Cathy, and Cathy had said to destroy any data that I had on it, the chromatograms, anything written. If I had done any calculations on the computer or had any information that was put into the computer, delete the computer files. I hadn't done that, but I had done the averaging by hand on a calculator. And so I took the data. The shredder was just outside the door of her office. We walked up the hall.
Whose office?
Robin's. I walked up the hall to the shredder, and she was standing, I think, sort of in her office door. The shredder was to the other side, so she would have been behind me. And we were talking when I shredded it. And I think that's when comments were exchanged about that was interesting data. Could we do some kind of experiments to try to verify what caused the large increase, such as potentially having flavors added to semi-works produced cigarette to see if we could generate that type of increase.
Well, would flavors be expected to generate tobacco-specific nitrosamines on pyrosynthesis?
I don't know, because almost all the cigarettes that we had made in semi-works, flavors weren't added to them.
But didn't you say earlier that the precursor to tobacco-specific nitrosamines were minor alkaloids?
That was the alkaloid precursor, but then there was a nitrosating agent which generated the NO, and that very likely could have come from the flavor component.
Is it your opinion, or do you have an opinion about whether there'd be enough flavorants in a production cigarette to generate a 10 times greater result?
Well, I think it would be very likely that it could, because the flavorings were added at a level of much higher than what the nitrosamine level was, and there was a large excess of alkaloid. You're talking about 1,000, 10,000 or more times concentration of alkaloids than you are nitrosamines. So if you have just some excess of the nitrosating agent or a different chemical reaction occurring, the flavor could have been a potential catalyst to the production of a nitrosating agent, which may already have been there they just needed a catalyst to generate, say, a particular free radical that might nitrosate. That was what was so interesting there that I thought needed to be investigated.
But now, other than this alleged incident here, you were never instructed to destroy any other research results at Philip Morris, were you?
Not that I can recall.
Don't you think you'd recall them if you had been asked?
I think I would.
Yeah. And you've never heard of any other instance at any place throughout R&D where someone had been asked to destroy data from experimentation, have you?
I don't recall any.
It was the general practice, the standard practice at Philip Morris, not to shred data, correct?
I would tend to think so, yes.
Push a button. Okay.
Okay. When you read the results on that chromatogram and saw that the N and K levels were 10 times higher than you expected, why didn't you just run off another batch to make sure it wasn't some artifact of the procedure?
Run off another batch of what?
Or just run the experiment again. Isn't that typical in science to run an experiment again when you get a surprising or unexpected result?
Yes. The best of my recollection, there were 2 runs that came out from the chamber. So we did have duplicate runs, best of my recollection. And there were 3 injections of each one. I think when I saw the results and when showed them to Robin, that had the result of that conversation been that not to destroy the data, but to investigate it further, that would have been the first thing we would have done, would have replicated it.
Mm-hmm. In your career at Philip Morris, did you ever get a result that was surprising that you didn't run right to a supervisor and show?
That I didn't run?
Correct.
I don't believe I ever got a result that was as surprising as that. But there were a lot of times that I got information that I thought was very interesting. It may not have been a high level, it could have been a low level. That I showed it to my supervisors immediately.
Is it your testimony that Philip Morris didn't run N and K levels on production cigarettes ever?
We didn't run nitrosamine analysis on production cigarettes. That was the instructions we had.
And so Philip Morris just never ran TSNA levels, as far as you're aware, on production cigarettes in the United States?
As far as I'm aware.
As far as you're aware, did Philip Morris run production cigarettes for TSNA levels anywhere in the world?
I don't have any knowledge in it.
You don't know whether they did it over at Neuchâtel?
Not to I don't have any knowledge that they did.
Did anybody in the external literature do TNSA testing of production cigarettes?
TSNA, but
Pardon me?
TSNA.
What did I say?
TNSA.
I'm sorry, yeah. But always correct. When I make a mistake like that, always correct me. I appreciate that.
Yes, most people that were doing research on nitrosamines, especially in particular with tobacco, outside of the tobacco industry, used commercial cigarettes, or they used the Kentucky reference cigarette.
So there are many examples in the external literature of reports of the TSNA levels in both side stream smoke and mainstream smoke in production cigarettes, correct?
That's correct, because they usually went down to the store and bought them.
Mm-hmm.
And but they usually referenced in the literature as being A, B, C, and D, or whatever. They usually didn't say what cigarette it was. So you really didn't have any idea. There wasn't any way to compare it back.
Right. But I guess my point is that there would be numerous reports in the external literature that would relate the TSNA levels, in fact the NNK levels of production cigarettes.
For fresh side stream smoke and for mainstream smoke, the levels that were in the general ranges for what was reported in the literature agreed well with what we got on our reference cigarettes.
Yeah.
But there weren't any reports that I was aware of at that time where somebody had a chamber that they age smoked. That was the difference.
Were there reports in the literature in the 1980s concerning the artifactual formation of NNK in aged smoke?
I know there were papers in the literature about artifactual formation and collection of smoke, both side stream and mainstream. I don't recall whether it was aged or not.
Mm-hmm. And there was some concern, or not, there was some evidence, wasn't there, that was published in the external literature that if you were collecting aged side stream smoke and analyzing it for TSNA levels, that there, in that process, was an artifactual production of NNK, correct?
You said aged. I'm not aware of any reports about aged. I remember specifically there were reports about mainstream and fresh side stream. I don't remember reports about aged.
Well, then let's stick with fresh side stream and aged smoke and the artifactual.
You said aged again, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, I meant fresh and mainstream.
Fresh side stream and mainstream, okay.
Okay, so let me just start all over again. Reports in the literature about artifactual NNK production in mainstream smoke and fresh side stream smoke when collected and run through the sorts of procedures that you used at Philip Morris. Were you aware of those?
Yes, it was.
And what was the thought as to what was causing the? Why don't we start here? How would you define or how would you explain, to a lay audience what artifactual production of NNK means?
That would mean that the NNK would be formed in the collection trap and not formed in the smoking or just a transfer of endogenous and collected in the trap. It would actually form in the trap.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have, say, just for an example, nornicotine transferred over and some nitrosating agent transferred over, and then you would get a reaction in the trap.
Mm-hmm.
That would be artifactual formation. We were very aware of the reports that were in the literature. Reports in the literature were wrong because we did extensive studies to verify that we weren't getting artifactual formation in our collection system by doping or adding to our collection traps the alkaloids that were there to try to produce artifactual formation. And we were very confident that we didn't have a problem with artifactual formation.
So do you think there's no possibility that the NNK level you saw in this experiment we've been talking about was the product of artifactual formation?
I don't think it would.
You need to replicate that experiment in order to determine whether or not it was, wouldn't you?
That would be one way of confirming it, yeah.
Right, and you didn't replicate it, did you?
You couldn't.
And the NNK result from that single experiment that we've been talking about, that doesn't prove anything with regard to the NNK level in the Virginia Slim cigarette or whatever it might have been to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, does it?
I think it does.
What does it prove?
As I say, you said a single run. I think it was 2 runs from the chamber, and the level that was measured, even if there had been a very large error in analysis, as much as say 50%, then instead of being 12,000, approximately 12,000, it may have been 6,000, but that still would have been 4 times higher than what we had been normally measuring. But it could have been on the low end. It really could have been 18,000 if there was an error. That we don't know.
But you're just speculating about what that range might be, correct?
We had a pretty good idea. We had done studies of what the precision of repetitive runs were. That's what their error analysis was.
But you never replicated that experiment, so you just don't know, correct?
Not that particular cigarette, no.
If valid replicated experimentation was run on Virginia Slim cigarettes to determine the NNK level in aged side stream smoke, and if those results were contrary to your results, would you accept those if they were valid and replicated?
If they were valid and replicated, yes, I would accept them. But I would have to know who was running them, and maybe even be a partner in the actual analysis.
Are you the only person who can do that? Are you the only person who's qualified to do that sort of analysis?
If I knew the person that was doing it, no, I'm not the only one that's qualified to do the analysis. But I don't know that I would just accept someone else's results because they replicated it if I didn't know them and didn't know their abilities. Because there are reports in the literature of artifactual formation in the collections of mainstream and side stream smoke that I knew were wrong. And those people claim to be right. And they replicated those results. They had bad analytical technique.
And it's possible to have bad analytical techniques even when you're a good analytical chemist, isn't it?
It's possible to make a mistake, yes.
Mm-hmm. It's possible you made a mistake in this run that we're talking about now, or these runs we're talking about now, correct?
It's possible.
Now, volatile nitrosamines are effectively filtered from mainstream smoke by regular cellulose acetate filters, correct?
That's correct.
And cellulose acetate filters, those are the kind of filters that are in filtered cigarettes around the world, correct?
Yeah. One of them, there's obviously some charcoal filter cigarettes. They do have cellulose acetate plugs in either end usually. So.
Now, the new nitrosamine that you discussed on direct examination, did you conclude with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that the unknown peaks that you observed in connection with those side stream smoke studies were indeed indicative of a new nitrosamine?
I did everything I could to verify.
And my question is, did you prove with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that that's a new nitrosamine, that was a new nitrosamine?
I believe so.
The people at Neuchâtel disagreed with you, didn't they?
Disagreed with me?
Correct.
Not that I'm aware of.
They didn't look at it? You don't believe that they looked at it and concluded that it wasn't a new nitrosamine?
They saw the peak and just ignored it.
On what basis do you say they ignored it?
They said they ignored it. Because when we,
Who said?
the people that ran data and initiative,
Who were those people?
I think the fellow that was in charge of the chamber at that time was a fellow Manfred Speck. And when I found that peak, and I went and showed it to Robin and discussed it, we called Neuchatel and spoke with them and asked them had they run those particular types of cigarettes with the papers on them, with the low visibility side stream papers, and they said yes, and we asked them had they observed a peak at the particular retention time, and they said yes we have, and we asked them that had they done anything to verify what it was, and they said no, they hadn't.
Now, those unknown peaks,
It's just one peak.
the unknown peak only occurred with that experimental paper, correct?
That's correct.
So, that unknown peak, that potential new nitrosamine, doesn't have any relevance to any of Philip Morris's commercial products because none of them use that experimental paper, correct?
None of them used that experimental paper. And so, yes, I would say that's probably true. It's the only experiments we ever observed that peaking.
Now, from the time you first saw that unknown peak in your experimentation to the time that you left Philip Morris, that was about 2.5 years or so, correct?
I don't remember exactly when I found it, but I think, yeah, it was probably something like that.
And during that 2.5 years, you had the support of your supervisors to investigate that unknown peak, correct?
Incorrect.
Why is it incorrect?
I feel that over those 2.5 years, I could have identified specifically that peak and the nitrosamine had I been allowed to use the instrumentation that was available in the research center, and I was denied that.
What instrumentation did you want to use that you say that you couldn't use?
I had measured the peak on using our gas chromatography thermal energy analyzer, and the thermal energy analyzer is very specific for nitrosamines. Some other compounds will produce a peak, but they have to be there in very high concentrations. Usually high enough concentration that if you run a normal GC, say with flame ionization detection or standard detection device, you'll be able to see a visible peak on the chromatogram. In this case, where that peak came out, there was nothing visible on a normal chromatogram, which meant that it was there in very low concentration, which would indicate that it was probably a nitrosamine. Also, nitrosamines, there's an NN bond, and that bond is a very weak bond, and it's easily degraded by exposure to ultraviolet radiation. So I did a series of studies by collecting samples that had all the other nitrosamines in them, along with the unknown peak, and exposing the sample to the ultraviolet radiation and determining the kinetics of the decomposition of that peak, and it fell right on top of all the other nitrosamines. And everything that I could find in the literature that other compounds similar to that would decompose under those conditions at very different rates. I went over to Analytical Research Division and worked with Dr. Francis Shue, HSU, and he had a special gas chromatograph, which they called it was a dual column chromatograph, where you could perform a technique called heart cutting, such that you had one column where you injected onto that column and got the separation, and then you could cut out a very specific segment and then pass that on to another column and re-chromatograph it again and spread it out and analyze what came out. And we coupled that to a thermal energy analyzer and to a mass spec and verified the peak and the mass spectrum for it. He had what they call a low-resolution mass spec, which would only give us ions, the parent peak and the daughter ions,
Daughter ions
to like 2 decimal places. And in order to make a specific identification of the exact composition of each peak, you would need to have 4 decimal places.
So you need a high resolution. And Nancy Jensen did that work, didn't she?
Nancy Jensen had a tandem mass spec that they spent $1 million for. It was a MS experiment. She injected the raw sample through her standard gas chromatograph and said, I can't identify all the peaks because of other background noise that's there. And I was told, go back and clean up the sample, concentrate it better. When I started trying to clean it up, the chromatography changed, so I had to start reinventing the chromatography, go into different columns, doing a whole lot of analytical work when all we really needed to do was take Francis Shue's heart-cutting GC and couple it to Nancy Jensen's tandem mass spec, and we could have probably had the answer in a couple of weeks. They would not allow us to do that.
Would it take some doing to get that coupling done that you described?
I don't think so.
Do you know, Sal?
I was told by Frank Shue, who was an expert in coupling mass specs to gas chromatographs, that he could do it very quickly and very easily.
He said those exact words to you?
Yes, he did.
Were you still answering that question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But with that information, when I approached Robin Kinser, because we were crossing divisional lines there to get Nancy Jensen's, to set up a protocol where we could get Nancy Jensen, the time in Nancy Jensen's lab to do that. Robin came back and said, you can't hook them up. It can't be done. There's problems with it.
Do you know that she's wrong?
I trust Frank Shue over her.
Do you know whether she talked to Frank Shue about it?
I have no idea what she talked to Frank Shue
Okay.
about.
Well, now, so you've just described to me, I think, 2.5 years of work that you did with your supervisor's approval on this unknown peak, correct? You just described work that Frank Shue did to try to determine what caused that unknown peak, right? You just described work that Nancy Jensen did to try to identify that unknown peak, correct? Okay, anybody else do work for you or with you to try to identify that unknown peak over that 2.5 year period?
Bob Forte.
Bob Forte.
And the sample cleanup and trying to reconcentrate the sample or concentrate it better and reinvent the chromatography we needed to separate it. He worked with me on it.
But it sounds like it's really complex, cutting-edge sorts of work that you're doing to try to identify this new nitrosamine, right?
Well, it's complicated research, yes.
And it was being done with the blessing of your supervisors, right? The work that you were allowed to do, right?
I don't think so.
Well, you just did it on a renegade basis? Is that what you're saying?
I think they allowed me to do certain experiments, but they prevented me from doing the critical experiment, which would have identified it.
Now, you're saying that Philip Morris allowed you to spend part of your time over 2.5 years and use the resources of Mr. Forte, Frank Shue, Mary Jensen, Nancy Jensen. Robin Kinser was involved too, wasn't she?
Only as section leader, just to be kept informed.
And you're saying that Philip Morris allowed you to do all that work and all those people to do all that work only to deny you the opportunity at the last moment to make the final conclusion? Why in the world would they have done that?
Because they had been working on this low visibility side stream paper for more years than that, and they finally had it to a point where they thought they were ready to put it on the market. And when I found that peak, the word came down from the director that if that was a nitrosamine, those low visibility side stream paper projects would be canceled.
And they never used those papers, did they?
They canceled the project, so they must have thought it was a nitrosamine.
Look, you're saying that Philip Morris allowed you to do all that work only to keep you from making the final conclusion. Let me ask you this. Did you ever make the final conclusion with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that what you were looking at was a new nitrosamine?
I believe it was.
But that's not my question. Do you believe that with a reasonable, no, do you believe it with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
I believe it, yeah.
Okay. Now you said earlier on direct examination that when you were terminated from Philip Morris, that you were still trying to identify the chemical composition of the new nitrosamine, right?
That's correct.
Can you know that it was a new nitrosamine without knowing its chemical composition?
We had, through the low resolution mass spec, we had ascertained the molecular formula.
Yes or no? Can you positively identify it as a new nitrosamine without knowing the chemical composition?
With absolute 100% certainty, no.
Okay. Now, you also said that this unknown peak was occurring at about 8.7 minutes, correct?
Somewhere in that 5, 7, something in that.
Yeah.
According to the chromatographic procedure, we can move it around if you change the flow rate or the temperature or whatever. I mean,
But it was eluting at about the same time as the volatile nitrosamines, correct?
well, a little bit later than that.
But it was a volatile nitrosamine, if a nitrosamine it was, correct?
I don't believe it was.
You believe it was tobacco-specific nitrosamine?
I don't know that it was a tobacco-specific nitrosamine, but it was not a typical volatile nitrosamine.
Would you agree with me that that this apparent new nitrosamine occurred in lower levels than NNK, NNN, and the other well-known nitrosamines?
No, it occurred at about the same level as NNK.
Now, doctor, let me see if I understand your testimony correctly. With Philip Morris's knowledge and support, you and others worked for 2.5 years or thereabouts to try to identify whether this unknown peak was a new nitrosamine. And when you got to the very point when you could determine that or not, Philip Morris would not allow you to verify that, correct? With this more sophisticated technology, correct?
That's my belief, yes.
Okay. And it's also your testimony that Philip Morris had this long-standing, low visibility side stream smoke paper that they were investigating, correct?
That's correct.
And it's also your testimony that they never used that paper in any commercial product, correct?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And obviously it would have taken a considerable amount of money to try to develop that paper, correct?
I would imagine they spent quite a bit of money on it.
Is it your testimony that Philip Morris didn't use that paper because you were about ready to discover that it generated a new nitrosamine?
It was my belief at the time that they had developed that paper to the point where they were ready to introduce it. And in doing the final testing on it is when it was running the chamber for the age side stream. And when we found that peak,
Running the chamber for?
the age side stream. And when we found this peak, I found the peak, that it had to be investigated before they would put it on the market. And I think that's why the statement was made from the director,
What director?
Jim Charles,
Okay.
that if this was a nitrosamine, if we showed that it was a nitrosamine, this was early on after we found it, that if this was a new nitrosamine, that the low visibility side stream paper projects, as it existed, would be terminated.
And that would be a reasonable position for Dr. Charles to take, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so your testimony, though, is that they precluded you from identifying this as either a new nitrosamine is not or not by denying your use of this equipment, correct?
I believe that's true.
But they terminated.
Makes sense.
But they terminated the project, the low side stream smoke paper project, correct?
That's what I understand, yeah.
But if they're going to terminate that expensive project, why wouldn't, on the basis of your research that may or may not have identified a new nitrosamine, why would they let you complete the research so that they could determine whether or not they could use the paper?
Your guess would be as good as mine.
Well, isn't it a more reasonable hypothesis that Philip Morris chose to discontinue that paper for a different reason, like low commercial acceptability?
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, almost any hypothesis would be more logical than the one you've posited, correct?
Except for the fact that the comment that was, or the statement that was made by Dr. Charles to me about the nitrosamine, and that if it was a nitrosamine, they would cancel the project.
You never worked up your research into something that you would consider a publishable form, did you?
Not on that.
I mean,
I was told to keep it confidential and not to discuss it. I was prevented from, in our quarterly updates, from giving any kind of detailed discussion about it. I would have to talk around it when I would show chromatograms and talk about other things that were in smoke samples that had that peak in it. It would just be there and it would just be ignored. It wouldn't be discussed. If somebody asked a question about it, it would just, there's just an extraneous peak.
so it was this big secret then that you weren't allowed to tell anybody?
Kept more confidential than other.
Okay.
Trust me.
And so it was so secret that you knew about it, right? That Jim Charles knew about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That Frank Shue knew about, right?
Mm-hmm.
That Nancy Jensen knew about, right? That Robin Kinser knew about, right?
That's right.
That Mr. Fort
Bob
knew
Forte.
about. Bob Forte knew about. Who
Just
else?
about everybody in the nitrosamine project knew about it.
Uh-huh.
But you're only talking about maybe 15 or 20 people out of between 500 and 600.
And you're saying that that information was never disseminated more widely within R&D?
It was never disseminated.
More widely within R&D?
I don't know who Cathy Ellis or Robin Kinser or Jim Charles might have discussed it with. There was never a report written on it. It was put in monthly reports and referred to that work continued on evaluation of the 8.5 or 8.7 peak, whichever it was.
Why don't you pull out? You said that you brought your performance appraisals with you. Why don't you pull those out and hand them to me if you don't mind, sir?
Huh? That's okay with you? Sure.
You probably pulled his out if you did. You probably pulled his out if you did. I'd like to mark that as the next numbered exhibit, please. Okay, if you don't mind, why don't you read to yourself the material on page 1, continuing on to page 2, under Describe Results Attained. And before we do that, sir, let me ask you, if you would, please, to identify this document that we're looking at that's been marked as exhibit number 7.
This document is my performance appraisal for the period of 1 November 1990 to 1 September 1991.
You had read this performance appraisal at my request, a portion of that, correct?
That's correct.
And tell me, who drafted this performance appraisal?
It was drafted by Al Warfield.
And who else would have seen this at the time?
Robin Kinser, Richard Karchman and Cathy Ellis.
And then you obviously saw it as well.
Yes.
Okay. And does that section I asked you to read refer to the apparent new nitrosamine that you had been looking into?
Yes.
So that information was so secret that it was put right in your performance appraisal, right?
It doesn't identify it as a nitrosamine, it just calls it an unknown component.
Because, just to make sure I got the answer to my question, in the segment that I asked you to read, there's a reference to the research that you were doing on the apparent or the possible new nitrosamine, correct?
Yes.
And at the time that this performance appraisal was written, had you yourself concluded that what you were looking at was a new nitrosamine as opposed to a known compound?
I had, yes, to the best of my recollection.
Had you reported that conclusion to any of your superiors?
To the best of my recollection, yes, I had.
Who?
Everyone that signed it on the back here. Al Warfield, Robin Kinser, Richard Karchman, and Cathy Ellis.
If you were satisfied that you had demonstrated that this was a new nitrosamine, why didn't you write up the results for publication?
Internal publication?
No, for external
Oh, we
publication.
never published anything on nitrosamines external.
Are you telling me that Philip Morris never published anything on nitrosamine research externally?
Not that I'm aware of.
So you're not aware of publications on nitrosamines out of Neuchâtel in the 1980s?
I was speaking of enrichment in the United States. And I'm not aware of any publications in the external literature out of Switzerland.
Are you aware of any, who's Tony Tricker?
Tony Tricker?
Do you know that name?
Not familiar with that name.
Okay. So the question again is, if you thought this was an important new discovery, why didn't you write up a paper that you could submit to the Manuscript Review Board for possible publication?
It wasn't complete.
So you weren't done with the research necessary to publish such results, is that right?
I hadn't specifically identified the chemical structure of the nitrosamine.
Now, you testified on direct examination that you were instructed not to make references to potential health effects that might be related to TSNAs, correct?
That's correct.
And that's because you didn't research the potential health effects of TSNAs, correct?
That's correct.
And for you to make statements in your research projects about possible health effects related to TSNAs would be tantamount to speculation, correct?
Yes.
So there was nothing inappropriate, was there, about telling you not to speculate about health effects that might be related to nitrosamines in your research reports, correct?
Not in making conclusions about health effects, no.
Now, you testified that in a couple of instances you were asked not to prepare a written report on some side stream smoke studies. Is that correct?
You talking about here today, or are you talking about in the previous deposition?
I'm sorry, here today, sir.
Okay. There was one particular project I remember specifically, but it involved both mainstream and side stream smoke.
Gotcha. And was that the one where you were trying to duplicate another study or replicate the results of another study?
It was, I was believe that that's what I was trying to do, but I wasn't specifically told that that's what I was trying to do.
Was it a published study?
I have no idea. I don't know what the study was, what the results were. I just knew that it was given to me by my director. I was told to keep it very confidential and to give the information only to him.
And it was about nitrosamines?
It was on the volatile nitrosamines.
And we've already talked about Philip Morris having considered nitrosamine research proprietary, haven't we?
Yes.
And so it's possible, isn't it, that the reason it was kept so confidential was because it was considered proprietary, correct?
Well, other nitrosamine research that was being done wasn't kept that confidential. It wasn't kept from other members of the nitrosamine project.
But is it possible that that proprietary nature of this research was the explanation for why it was not, why it was so tightly controlled?
I had no idea why it was so tightly controlled.
You don't have any idea one way or the other why it was so tightly controlled?
I have no idea.
You know, just thinking to my own work, a lot of times I'll ask somebody to report to me back on a research project or something just over the telephone, orally. I say, don't put it in writing, not because there's any... What I'm trying to say is that in some circumstances, speed is important, correct? You know,
Yes.
and sometimes, and it takes some time to write up reports, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so if you want to have an answer quickly, sometimes you might ask somebody just to say, give it to me orally and don't worry about writing up a report, correct?
That's correct.
That happens sometimes with you at Philip Morris, didn't it?
Yes, probably.
Nothing wrong with that, is there?
No. But if you'll refer back to my performance appraisals, you'll see that when I did that particular work, I was written up as having approached a very confidential project for my director, kept it very confidential, and completed it in a very much shorter period of time than was initially expected for me to do it, and I was commended for doing it. So it was pointed out in my performance appraisals that it was much more highly confidential than the other nitrosamine work going on.
Was there anything inherently wrong with that?
That makes it different from the other nitrosamine work that was going on.
Right, but is there anything inherently wrong with that?
I don't know, because I don't know exactly what the purpose of the work was.
Now, the TSNA research was transferred from Philip Morris Richmond to Neuchâtel in Switzerland at some point after your termination, correct?
That's what I understand, yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the phrase or concept, centers of excellence, as it applied to Philip Morris?
I won't say it as applies to Philip Morris, but in general, yes.
But are you aware of a program or a project that was undertaken at R&D in Philip Morris where research facilities were looked at to determine which ought to be the research facility to do particular research based upon excellence, and the process of then switching all of one type of research to one of those facilities based upon the excellence of that research and to avoid duplication?
I'm familiar with that, but I'm also familiar with the fact that, as if you want to refer back to my performance appraisals again, that I worked with not only FTR and Neuchâtel, but also BIFO, and that I was the one that developed the methods for analysis and collection and transferred that information to them, and they used what I developed. So based on that, if you wanted to infer a center of excellence, I think it would be in Richmond.
Is it possible they had advanced beyond what you were doing here in Richmond?
I don't think so.
But you don't know so, do you?
From all the information that I got from them and the number of personnel that they had working, which was one person part-time, where we had essentially anywhere from 8 to 10, I think we would be considered the center of excellence.
There's only one person working part-time at Neuchâtel on nitrosamine research in 1992.
To the best of my knowledge, yes. There was only one person working on it when I visited there in 1986. And in my correspondence with them over the years from then on until I left, to my knowledge, that was the only person they had working on it.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is the research was transferred to Neuchâtel and centered there rather than Richmond after your termination, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the reasons for this program that we've discussed is simply the elimination of redundancy. Is that correct, or do you know?
I don't know. It's possible. There was work being done at in BFO. I don't know if it was continued or whether it was transferred to Initiative.
You don't know one way or the other?
Don't know one way or the other.
Would you agree that by 1990, thousands of scientific articles have been published on tobacco-specific nitrosamines?
And the open milk?
Yes.
Yes.
A pretty thoroughly researched topic, wasn't it?
It was, yes, very heavily researched.
And there's nothing special about Philip Morris that would allow them, as opposed to anybody else, to identify a new nitrosamine and to characterize it and publish it, is there?
No, there's...
Nitrosamines are found in many substances, aren't they?
Yes.
Found in beer,
Yes.
found in fish,
Cooked fish, yeah.
cooked steak,
Yeah.
coffee.
Probably. Just about anything that's been heated.
And so the presence of nitrosamines in tobacco is not indicative of some unique property of tobacco, is it?
Not the volatile nitrosamines. I think the tobacco specifics may be.
I've got a 3-week-old son who is eating from a bottle. Are there nitrosamines in the nipple of his bottle that he's eating from?
I've read in the literature that there are.
He's not in danger of contracting cancer from that, is he?
I have no idea. I don't know what the level of nitrosamines in the nipple are, but I know there's been published literature that puts an upper limit on that level at 10 parts per billion, or approximately 10 parts per billion, best of my recollection.
In your opinion, is nicotine a direct precursor to NNK?
Direct. Could you be more specific about direct?
I don't think I can.
Can I try to be?
Yes, would you please?
If you take nornicotine, you can nitrosate the pyrrolidine nitrogen directly. You can't do that with nicotine because the pyrrolidine nitrogen has a methyl group on it, which makes it a tertiary nitrogen compound. So it has to go through an intermediate reaction step to open up the pyrrolidine ring to free the nitrogen to be a secondary amine instead of a tertiary amine before it can be nitrosated. So nicotine can be a direct precursor to whatever this intermediary is that can lead to nitrose to NNK. But our studies on just adding nicotine to tobacco and getting increased nitrate to see if we got increased NNK, we did not get an increased NNK. So in that case, no, it would not be, in that context, it would not be a direct precursor.
Has it been established to your satisfaction that nicotine is an indirect precursor to NNK?
I believe it is, yes.
Do you think it's been established by the scientific literature?
I think it had, yeah.
Let's see. Going back to the discussion of the increased levels of NNK that you say that you saw in connection with Virginia Slims, who would have done the initial prep work for that experimentation? I mean, was there someone involved in plugging the cigarettes into the machine and all that sort of thing other than yourself?
Oh, yes. Roger Combs and his people did that. They were in the process of reconfiguring the smoking machine to accept that configuration of cigarette relative to what had been being run, which was a standard circumference 85 millimeter length. They were adapting it to a smaller circumference, longer length because of the auto-loading feature of the sample of the cigarette machine and the auto-lighting feature. They had to reconfigure it so that it would load and light properly.
What would had to be done in order to reconfigure the machinery?
The cigarettes are in a hopper, and they are fed down. There's a little gear, I guess you'd call it, turns and drops one cigarette at a time. And the hole that accepts the cigarette in the turret that's on top, when that cigarette drops down, there's a little plunger that comes forward and pushes the end of the cigarette and pushes it into that hole. And so the inserts that accept the cigarette into the turret had to be changed to a smaller circumference or diameter.
What were those inserts made out of?
Stainless steel, I think. They were removable, had rings around them on the inside where they put in. And then the plunger that pushed the cigarette in had to be set such that it pushed it in far enough to secure it, but not enough to break it. And then also the positioning of the lighter had to be set such that it would light the cigarette when it came by the lighter.
When you reconfigure a machine like that, do you have any concerns that the reconfiguration may cause some artifactual results?
I don't think it would cause artifactual results. I think you might break a lot of cigarettes before you get it set right.
But as a scientist, you wouldn't have any concern that reconfiguration would possibly cause any artifactual results with regard to NNK levels?
I wouldn't think so. I think you might make a number of runs where you broke a lot of cigarettes and you just shut it down and start it all over again.
Do you know whether that occurred?
I have no idea. If I had to guess, I would probably say yes. But
okay. Now, when the subpoena came for your deposition, was that a surprise, or did you have forewarning about that? The first subpoena notice before your 2/20/97 deposition.
I wouldn't say it was a surprise because I had been contacted by the Food and Drug Administration back in, I think, 1994, and I think a couple of other people had called me. I don't remember who they were, and wanted me to talk to them, and I told them that I would not enter into any kind of discussions. I had a lot of media people call me. I didn't want to talk with anyone. And I told the people in the Food and Drug Administration if they wanted to talk to me, they could do it on record.
Now, we talked a little bit about, on direct examination, you talked a little bit about running experimental cigarettes versus running production cigarettes, correct?
Yeah.
And as a scientist, if you want to test one parameter, one variable in a cigarette. What you would do, wouldn't you, is have two cigarettes that were exactly identical except for the variable you wanted to check, correct?
Probably have more than two.
We'd have two different types.
Might have a range, yes.
Okay. And isn't one good reason to use experimental cigarettes is that they're very uniform?
They're not only very uniform, but you can have them made to direct your experiment toward the variable that you want to study.
Right. And so you use a controlled cigarette and then an identical cigarette with the exception of that one variable that you would test, correct?
Yes.
Can you do that with production cigarettes?
It'd be pretty difficult.
Because production cigarettes aren't uniform, are they?
They're not as uniform because the blend would be the same, and there's only one of them.
And production cigarettes will vary one from another within a pack, within a carton, and within a run, wouldn't they?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about varying. I mean,
Well, they would vary in amounts of flavorants and tobacco blend, et cetera, such that you couldn't use those cigarettes in an experimental basis to check just one particular variable change, one from the other. Could you?
well, it would depend on what you're measuring. I mean,
You said it depends on what I'm saying.
Depends on what you're measuring.
So let's talk. Yeah. So let's talk about the tobacco-specific nitrosamines, because that's what you were measuring, right?
yeah, well, there's not enough data to make an interpretation on that because we don't run a production cigarette. If you want to go back to, say, nicotine, or weight of tobacco in a cigarette, or something like that, then the CI lab and the QA lab run those on a continuous basis all the time.
Okay. Let me ask you this.
And there's a certain target level, plus or minus.
Okay. Let me ask you this. You want to run an experiment to see whether the addition of a particular chemical will reduce the level of nitrosamines in a cigarette. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.